Hello, and welcome to our webcast for March 29th, 2019. My name is Amy Hasbrook, and with me is Taylor Hyatt, our outreach coordinator and policy analyst. You'll notice that who isn't here is Christian DeBlay because he had an eye surgery earlier this week, so he's not going to be able to join us. He's sitting at 45-degree angle, not being able to read anything. So he's just putting out this one. So we are doing the webcast on behalf of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet. TVNDY is a non-religious organization by and for people with disabilities and our allies. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending of life practices that have a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities. We have two topics today. The first is the pelvic mesh, medical device failures, and assisted suicide and euthanasia. And the second is Britain's Royal College of Physicians goes neutral on assisted suicide and euthanasia, sort of. I mean, they went neutral, but their process stunk. So the first item, the pelvic mesh, medical device failures, and assisted suicide and euthanasia. In January, we heard a news report on Radio-Canada that mentioned an unnamed woman who applied for euthanasia due to pain caused by a pelvic mesh she had had implanted to control stress urinary incontinence, or SUI. The story focused on a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Surgery, showing higher rates of depression in women who had surgery for complications from the pelvic mesh devices. That surgery is one of the possible ways to deal with the problem. And it didn't talk about the depression results for women who had other treatments or who didn't have any treatments, even though they had problems. So that was kind of not a very thorough study. Though we weren't able to find out any more information about the unnamed woman, we have learned a lot about the problems caused by the pelvic mesh, how hard it is to get help when something goes wrong, the surprisingly lax approval process, the lack of informed consent, and how the pelvic mesh is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of medical device failures. So for more than 20 years, companies such as Johnson & Johnson and Boston Scientific have been aggressively marketing devices to treat women's incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse, which is a condition where the muscles that hold the bladder and reproductive organs in place become weak, allowing the organs to sag and stretch out of place, and that can cause incontinence and other problems. So these are not life-threatening problems. They're very, they can be annoying and expensive if you have to use pads all the time, but they're not life-threatening problems. But companies have been very aggressive about marketing this surgery and acting like it's, the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Where would shame come in? Because we've talked about the shame of using things like Depends before.
Right, exactly. And, women, one of Jack Kevorkian's victims essentially said that because she had become incontinent, she couldn't bear to live. And that is a very common feeling for women. That and you can't control your bladder, then your life is horrible.
And another thing, if I may jump in again, when I hear people talk about disability as being embarrassing, the need of personal attendance being embarrassing,
right.
The analogy that comes up often is somebody, excuse me, but needing to wipe your bum.
Yes.
Mm. And so that also comes in somehow.
Right. And that is also considered such a horrible, horrible fate that anyone in their right mind would
want to avoid. Yeah.
Someone wipe their ass. Okay. So the pelvic mesh is a band of plastic netting that acts like a sling to support the internal organs. After the mesh is implanted, tissue grows around and through it to form a solid barrier. And problems can occur if the mesh is strung too tightly, if it shrinks, if it moves, if it rubs up against muscles or nerves, pokes through the wall of the vagina or rectum, erodes, falls apart, or traps bacteria that cause infections. Now, that's a lot of things that can go wrong.
Yep.
And that wasn't all of them, but I just tried to get a list there. This can cause severe pain, bleeding, incontinence, fevers, and even death. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has reported 77 deaths from the meshes, and at least one Canadian, Chrissy Bradchick, died from infections related to the mesh. So, you know, people have died. And this wasn't necessarily information that was being widely made available. The reported rate of complications, like how many people, varies widely and depends on the source. While one doctor from the University of California at Los Angeles claims the complication rate is about 120 or 5%, a 2017 study of 92,000 records of pelvic mesh surgeries in the United Kingdom, published by Scientific Reports, found that nearly 10% of women had complications. A lot more. And the Food and Drug Administration issued a report just last month that looked at multiple studies and found that exposure and erosion of the mesh is fairly common, approximately 11 to 18% of complications. That's a lot.
That's nearly 1 in 5. How are these things still allowed to be used?
Right. That's the question. That's the question. So, yeah, especially, I mean, since in Australia they've pulled them from the market. So, women who've had problems with the device have had a very hard time getting treatment. Many women report being told that the physical pain symptoms are due to depression. Right. Yeah, you're just depressed. This physical pain, this infection, you're just depressed. Or that they're exaggerating it.
To bring it into assisted suicide for a second, if someone is facing physical pain, they're eligible for assisted suicide. And the powers that be want to expand eligibility to allow it for depression as well.
Well, the person their death has to be reasonably foreseeable. But since some people have died as a result of this mesh, then it's possible that they could say my death is reasonably foreseeable because I can't have this thing removed and it's causing these infections that I'm going to die of sepsis.
Right. Sorry, I wasn't clear. So if that eligibility expansion goes through, people are going to be eligible to die either way, and you're going to end up in a vicious circle where people are depressed because their doctors aren't believing them, and they're still pushed towards death no matter what you do.
Right. One woman's doctor refused to look at samples of threads from the mesh that she collected from her urine. So she found these threads in her underpants, and she put them on a microscope slide put them under the microscope, looked at them. Oh my gosh, these are the threads from the mesh. Tried to show them to her doctor, but her doctor wouldn't look at them. Yeah. Okay. So even when the women are believed, most doctors don't know what to do about the problem. A Radio-Canada enquête report followed one woman who was advised to try 4 different treatments by 4 different doctors. She ultimately chose to have the device removed by a 5th doctor in the United States, which cost her $20,000, who has done more than 1,000 of the procedures. So she finally found somebody who knew what they were doing, but they weren't in Canada, and so she had to pay, and she's not going to get reimbursed. She's going to try, but she's not optimistic about being reimbursed. It's worth noting that the Journal of the American Medical Association depression study focused only on women who'd had surgery to deal with the problems with the pelvic mesh. It didn't discuss women who were not believed, which is a lot, or not treated for the problem. In other words, the depression rates are probably much higher than those reported in the study. Apparently, once implanted, the mesh is very difficult to remove. One doctor described it as trying to get bubble gum out of hair. And when I said that to somebody recently, he said, well, all you have to do is freeze it. You can't do that with somebody's vagina.
Yeah, you're not gonna.
Vaginas.
Oh.
Okay, most of the products currently on the market were approved through a process that's common to the United States and Canada that allows the sale of new devices that are similar or substantially equivalent to ones already being sold, even if those products were later recalled. And one study traced 61 devices of these pelvic meshes back to a pelvic mesh that was approved in 1996, which was later recalled. So 61 were approved based on this first one, and the first one was recalled. So, yeah, great. Testing of such products was done by collecting reports of any problems with the implants. A Toronto surgeon, Dr. David Urbach, pointed out that once the devices are on the market, it's sort of like a large clinical trial in which we are all participants. In other words, we're all guinea pigs. Oy. Yeah. If it's clinical trial, it is not well run. For instance, doctors and hospitals don't have to report issues with the medical devices in Canada. The materials we looked at suggested that Health Canada has been unresponsive to doctors and patients who try to report problems with the medical devices. And there's a form online that you can fill out saying, what side effect you got from the medical device, but the form only allows one side effect per form.
Oh.
So,
and I presume only one person looking at it when you want to pass it on to your doctor, to Health Canada, to the province, to all these different levels.
Right, exactly. In Canada, only companies that make the devices are required to report problems with their products, and people don't generally go back to the company when they have a problem. They go to their doctor.
They might not even know who the company is.
Right, exactly. So when a woman reports pain or infection, her doctor doesn't have a database of mesh failure reports from other doctors to draw on in helping make his diagnosis or her diagnosis. And since the doctor doesn't have to report the mesh failure, it's unlikely that anyone else will learn about it.
No reporting. Where have we seen this before?
Yeah.
There's a problem with authority and secrecy all shot through our entire healthcare system.
Yes, indeed. They don't call it the medical industrial complex for nothing. Okay. As well, information is hard to come by. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Unlike in other countries, information submitted for approval of medical devices like post-approval studies, inspection reports, or warning letters is not available to the public in Canada. Oh, so
Yeah.
even if the companies have to report problems, that information isn't available. So even when the medical devices are restricted in developed countries, for example, the pelvic mesh was banned in Australia, companies simply market them in other countries where the regulations are less strict.
So in the US, watching American TV, you can see ads for new medications all the time.
Yeah.
And they'll say, this is the medication, this is what it does, these are the side effects.
Right.
Why don't Canadians have an equivalent of that? And do you think having one would make a difference?
Well, I mean, the other thing is, if you've ever listened to those ads, more than half of the advertisement time is taken up with possible side effects and complications. You know, this is a miracle drug, although it could make your head fall off. It could make a and some of the side effects are, it seems like drugs and medical devices are treated differently, at least in Canada. So I'm not sure about medical devices in Canada in terms of warnings for on advertisements, but generally the advertisements are directed to the doctors who are expected to sell it to the patients.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
In May of 2014, Health Canada issued advisories about the, quote, potential risk of complications associated with transvaginal implantation of surgical mesh devices. The advisory for the general public says the mesh devices have, quote, been associated with reports of, and then they list a bunch of symptoms, but the list doesn't communicate the seriousness of the problem. So, for example, it doesn't include death. It's a problem that has occurred in association with this product.
And also been associated with reports of. That language is just not strong enough.
Right, exactly. That's the point.
Yeah.
The advisory suggests that people review the patient information that comes with the mesh product, if available.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. And understand the pros and cons of the procedure. So it's referring you to the literature put out by the company that makes it, which of course is going to be absolutely accurate, fair, and balanced, of course.
Yeah, it's going to sell it and it's going to gloss over things.
Yes, of course. So this is their idea of informed consent.
Yeah, no.
But even the notice to hospitals issued at the same time failed to mention deaths caused by the mesh, referring only to life-altering events.
Life-altering events. You lose your life.
Yeah.
Well done, you guys. Well done.
Definitely altered my life. Many women have successfully sued the companies that make the pelvic mesh devices because they were not informed of the risk they were taking when they chose the surgery. They didn't know how often complications occurred, and that took me a while to track down that particular statistic. They were not informed how serious the complications could be, including death. They were not told how difficult it is to treat the problems caused by the device. They were not informed that it was difficult or impossible to remove the implant, or that even if the mesh were removed, the damage might be irreversible. And that's happened to a lot of people, that, you know, the doctor couldn't take out the whole mesh. They took out part of the mesh, but then that didn't solve the problem, or, you know, then they had to do another surgery to try to take out more of the mesh. And oh my gosh. So the pelvic mesh controversy is similar to scandals linked with other medical devices and other women's health issues that have come up in the past. The reporting on the pelvic mesh is part of a global collaboration of journalists looking at medical devices called the Implant Files. The investigation found that many other medical devices have benefited from the same permissive approval schemes, caused injuries and deaths, been dumped in poor countries where rules were less strict, and have been subject to lawsuits and have prompted calls for increased regulations. This includes artificial joints, heart valves, insulin pumps, implanted pain medication delivery systems, and spinal fusion devices, especially used not in the way they're supposed to be used. So that they have the fusion device and that they say it's supposed to be used this way, but we often see doctors use it this other way. So go ahead. Even though that causes a problem. Okay, so also for many women, the pelvic mesh is a grim reminder of the many intrauterine device contraceptives that have been marketed and recalled over the years, causing injury and death to thousands of women. It also brings to mind the controversial breast implants that rupture and cause cancer or other illnesses. Having one's reproductive system used as a proving ground for experimental devices, then not being believed when those products turn out to be harmful, is yet another example of adding a gender-based insult to injury.
I was going to bring up the IUDs. I don't think the idea of men controlling women's fertility to prevent them from growing their families as much as they like, as opposed to forcing women to have more kids than they'd like to have, and the experimentation in the contraceptive industry get discussed enough. But that's for another episode.
Right. Well, you know, and it's exactly the issue, because when I was in college in the 80s, the IUD issue was huge because, you know, they'd been introduced in the 60s, and it seemed like every time they introduced a new IUD, it had to get pulled from the market because it was perforating the walls of women's uteruses, yeah, and causing infections and death and all kinds of horrible things. And lo and behold, I'm doing this research and there's another IUD that just had to be pulled from the market. So 30 years later, give me a freaking 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay, but more important to our purposes at Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet, how is it that a person isn't provided enough information to give informed consent about a medical device that, once implanted, is nearly impossible to remove and that has a nearly 20% failure rate, which can cause extreme pain, permanent damage, and even death? And how is it that a person in that position turns to euthanasia as the only way out and no one bats an eye?
Yeah.
Okay. Second subject. Calm down. Calm down.
Or will we?
Oh, maybe. Royal College of Physicians goes neutral on assisted suicide and euthanasia, sort of. I mean, they did go neutral, but the process was pretty slimy. It's been reported that Britain's Royal College of Physicians has gone neutral on assisted suicide, but as so often happens when the subject is assisted suicide and euthanasia, you have to look a little deeper to figure out what's really going on. BioEdge reported that before the poll, the RCP leadership set the threshold impossibly high by requiring euthanasia opponents to produce a 60% majority for keeping with the RCP's current position against assisted suicide and euthanasia. So usually if you're challenging a position that exists, it's just like,
50% plus one, isn't it?
Yeah, 50% plus one, majority, and, we'll go that way. No, they set it up so that they not only had to produce all 60% of the votes, but they also had to, get a lot of people, convince people to come out and support the status quo, which is a very hard thing to do. People don't tend to support the status quo. They tend to say, oh, well, status quo, no problem. Everybody's all okay.
Yeah.
So
this is what people, I don't know how to say it. Basically, there's something wrong with you if you oppose us. This is what everybody's supposed to do now.
Right. Okay, so the vote was taken via an online poll, which, not surprisingly, only drew 19% of the RCP's 36,000 members. The respondents were probably also skewed toward younger members, in that older doctors might be less likely to participate in an online poll. Another mark against the democratic process. Though 43% of those who voted opposed assisted suicide, this majority wasn't large enough to maintain the status quo, even though only 32% supported assisted suicide. So as 43 opposed assisted suicide, 32% supported assisted suicide. But the remaining 25% of respondents said that they felt that the college should take a neutral position, and this was added to the 32%, which supported assisted suicide, and so it turned it into a majority.
How are these things so binary? How dare they just lump the unsure people into either side? It's especially frustrating for our purposes, excuse me, that the side in favor was slanted, but we really do need to watch how polls like these are done. I'd be just as mad if the opposition to assisted suicide was inflated. We want the polls to reflect what people really think.
Right, exactly. And usually, when you're talking about people who take a neutral position, the neutral position goes with the majority. So, but no, they decided to put the neutral position with the minority, and so they got the majority and blah, blah, blah.
So they didn't even follow proper survey methodology then.
Well, I don't know if that's proper survey methodology, but it's what usually happens. So they had their agenda. They knew what they wanted the outcome to be, and they did everything possible to make that outcome happen. And lo and behold, it happened. So that's how they got the answer they wanted. All right. So if you want information about the subjects that we talk about, you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet. You can visit our website at tvndy.ca. You can email us at info@tv-ndy.ca, or you can follow us on Twitter @TVNDY. Thanks to Taylor for helping out today, and thank you all for watching. We will see you next time.
Hopefully all three of us. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.